I have this rule for my photography that I call the Iceland Rule, which basically says, don't go to Iceland for photography. I've got nothing against Iceland. I've never been, but it seems like an amazing place. It's obviously incredibly photogenic. Clearly, lots of people really enjoy going there and doing photography. But this rule isn't actually about Iceland. It could just as easily be called the Patagonia Rule, or the Lofoten Islands Rule, or the Mesa Arch Rule, or a bunch of other things. There's maybe a few dozen of these places all around the world that are just insanely popular for landscape and travel photography, and I'm kind of talking about all of those. It's the kind of place where when you search for the location on Google Images, you get tens of thousands of more or less the exact same shot. If you've been doing photography for any amount of time, you probably know what I'm talking about. And that's interesting, right? Why do so many people feel the need to go to these locations and spend their very limited time off, and in some cases spend thousands of dollars to essentially make their own copies of what's come before them? Nothing inherently wrong with that, right? I mean, do whatever makes you happy and fulfilled, and if that makes you happy and fulfilled, then that's amazing. But I think that it is interesting, and I think that it's worth digging into a little bit. I think a lot of this desire to replicate these iconic shots in these iconic locations is because of the limited time that a lot of us have, especially in places like the US, where there's a lot of people who earn a decent amount of money, but who might only get a couple weeks off from work per year. They want to make sure that if they're going to take a trip for photography, then they'll come back with something amazing to show for it. And these places, these iconic places, photographically speaking, they have a lot of low-hanging fruit. They're epic enough as is to where you pretty much just have to show up, and you're almost certainly going to get something that has a big wow factor and probably a whole bunch of shots that are pretty incredible and might get some nice attention on social media, even if they're not the most original. And we've seen lots of other people go there. A lot of famous photographers go to these places, and everyone seems to come back with world-class images. So it kind of seems like a safe bet. But I would ask, if you're going to go spend a week in Iceland one year, and then 10 days in Patagonia another year, and then maybe we go to Namibia after that, and then a few days in Death Valley, and then the Faroe Islands or something, I would ask, are you going to be able to go deep enough into any of these places in a way that I think is required to make interesting and somewhat unique work? Or are you going to end up with a portfolio of postcard-esque images that are kind of indistinguishable from a bunch of other photographers who also have the money and the resources to travel like that? And earlier I said there's nothing wrong with approaching photography like this, and I stand by that, but I am asking these as leading questions because I know what the answers are for me when I'm honest with myself. And I think there's a lot of other people out there who might think that this kind of approach is kind of what you have to do. It's what the pros seem to do. We need these kind of images for our portfolios. But then for them, it doesn't actually sound all that fulfilling, all that appealing, at least not in the long run. We're kind of doing it because we feel like we have to do it. It's the way to approach photography. This desire to replicate these iconic compositions and photograph in these iconic places, it's pretty common, especially when we're beginners. We see a shot of like the Tetons with those iconic barn buildings in the foreground, and we think, ooh, I need to go there and get that shot. It's the low-hanging fruit. I mean, if we were learning guitar, we'd be playing Stairway to Heaven or Smoke on the Water. It's just kind of a part of the process of being a beginner and of learning how to do photography in this case. It's very common. I think a lot of people go through it, but I would just say, please don't stop there. It probably won't be very fulfilling in the long run. So where do we go from there? I've got 4 different approaches. They overlap a little bit, and we don't have to just pick one, but hopefully this will spark some ideas if you're feeling a bit stuck and if you're feeling a bit scared to move away from these iconic places because you don't have a lot of time or for any other reasons. So the first option, the first approach, is the Iceland Rule, to basically just reject these iconic places from a photography perspective at least, and say, you know, I can't go to Iceland. Everyone goes to Iceland. Everyone photographs there. I'm going to go somewhere less popular. I'm going to be a little bit of a photography hipster, and say the more obscure location, the better. I'm going to go to Kyrgyzstan or Newfoundland or Colombia or Tasmania or something, or maybe just shoot locally wherever that happens to be. I think this is great, honestly. I joke about it being the photography hipster approach, but I do think that it's a good approach. I more or less do this a lot, and I think it leads to pretty interesting images. You'll never be the first person to photograph an area, not in 2024, it doesn't work like that anymore. But the more you dig in, the more you realize that these iconic places are kind of a fractal thing where there are iconic spots at all of the different levels of destinations. We have like globally iconic destinations and locations. We have regionally iconic locations and compositions, and then locally iconic ones as well. But that said, if you go somewhere that hasn't been photographed millions of times by tourists from all over the world every day, I think that you're more likely to find shots that are a little bit more original, a little bit more unique, and that truly feel like yours. And I've also just found that it's generally a more enjoyable experience, for me at least. A second approach would be to say, you know, these iconic places, they are pretty cool, and it would be a shame to never visit. And so in that case, we just show up as primarily as a tourist, as a traveler. And of course, we're photographers, we're going to bring a camera with us. But the primary goal is to just enjoy the place. We're going to take some photos if and when we want, but there's a lot less pressure on ourselves to make something amazing. You know, for better or worse, these places have been photographed thousands and thousands of times before, and it's unlikely that we're going to show up on just, you know, a few day trip or a week-long trip and get something amazing that's going to stand out. So that's totally fine as long as we set our expectations right and just know that if we want to just see the place because it's an iconic place, it's iconic for a reason, then just show up mostly as a tourist and then just bring a camera along as well. I did this recently when I was down in California for my sister's wedding, and I decided that after the wedding, I wanted to go down to Yosemite for a few days afterwards. Obviously, Yosemite is one of the most iconic, one of the most photographed places on the entire planet, and I was going to go there for basically 2 days. The chances of me coming away with anything that are going to stand out within kind of the global body of work that is Yosemite photography, basically zero. But I still wanted to see it. I hadn't been to Yosemite since I was 3 years old or something. And so I just kind of went primarily as a tourist. I brought my camera along as well, but there was less pressure. I didn't feel pressure to wake up at the crack of dawn to go hike somewhere and see sunrise because that didn't sound interesting to me on that day. But I just kind of explored around and brought my camera with me. And I did, I think, end up with some nice images, which was a nice bonus, but it wasn't the primary goal of the trip. I'm also going to be taking this approach more or less when I spend 2 weeks in Tokyo this November. It's going to be sort of like a hybrid vacation and photography trip, but I'm just approaching it mostly like a tourist. I'm going to bring a camera with me, obviously. I'm going to be taking a lot of photos along the way. And if I come home with some nice shots, then that's great. If I come home with a bunch of shots and I can create a body of work about my time in Tokyo, then that's awesome as well. But there's not a lot of pressure on the trip to be first and foremost a photography trip. So if I, come home with just a couple okay shots, that's not a big deal either. A third approach would be to say, you know what, maybe I can shoot it in a different way. I can shoot it in my own way. I'm gonna put a unique spin on a place. I'm gonna go to Iceland and do a whole project about the roads there, or do a project about tourism in Iceland, or maybe I spend the whole time in Reykjavik and I photograph what it's like to actually live there, or go off the beaten path a little bit, and instead of doing the ring road and doing all the iconic waterfalls, maybe I spend some time in the West Fjords instead. A couple examples of this. Got some books. These are actually examples from Iceland. Jessica Auer, I think is how you pronounce her name. She did a project called Looking North, and she lives in Iceland and photographed kind of about the tourism there, tourism industry. And so instead of being just the classic shots of Iceland, it's photography about tourism on Iceland, which I think is pretty interesting and a little bit different from the typical Iceland shots that you see. Another Iceland example, Greta Ribas is one of my absolute favorite photographers. She's a photojournalist based out of Maine, and she did a project about hot springs all around the world, including in Iceland. And I don't know, I flipped open to a random page, maybe that's Iceland. But because she was able to kind of take this specific approach to photographing iconic places, I think she was able to come away with really interesting work that showed Iceland and all these other iconic places like Japan in a deeper, I think more interesting way than if she were to have just gone to Gullfoss and Skogafoss, and I think those are waterfalls. Again, I've never been. So yeah, lots more examples. I got more books, but I think that's a good example there. The fourth approach would be to say, you know what? I think there are more good shots to be had, more interesting shots to be had in these places. So I'm going to go back time and time again, and I'm going to go deeper than pretty much anyone else and just spend the time required to actually get to know this place and go beyond just the surface level images that can easily be had there, and build up a body of work that can really only be had from spending years and even decades on the photography and on exploring the area. Obviously, this isn't an easy approach, and it, I think, is a little bit underrated in the social media age where we're often looking for the low-hanging fruit and looking for the quick wins. But I do think that it's a really interesting way to end up with interesting work about a place, even an iconic place. So many good examples of this. So I think the Grand Canyon is sort of like one of the most photogenic and iconic places in the world. And a lot of people, myself included, just sort of show up, go to a couple of viewpoints, maybe take a nice sunset image. But there's so much more to see there, and it takes a long time and a lot of work to see it and to photograph it well. This book by Pete McBride, National Geographic photographer, is a project where he and another person, I think a writer named Kevin Fedorko maybe, they traversed the entire canyon from kind of the top of it to the bottom of it, not like rim to the bottom, but like they went along the river. And there aren't trails there, so they were bushwhacking, and it was incredibly difficult. And because of that, they were able to get shots and photograph the canyon. I'm just going to open to random pages, but in a way that really you couldn't do if you didn't go that deep. So it's an example of going really deep into a project, or really deep into an area, making a project about an iconic location, but in a way that can only come from years and you know, a long time and a lot of work to really dive deep into a place. So those are the 4 different approaches that I have to photograph iconic places and to kind of approach photography within this context. But I'd be curious to hear what you guys think. Is Iceland on your photography bucket list? Have you been before? Do you enjoy photographing places like this? Let me know down in the comments below. And with that, I'll say thanks so much for watching. Thanks as always for your support, and I'll see you next time. Bye.